Hello, and welcome to my channel. My name is Jonathan Cohn, and today I have my book review of the book Fire and Blood by George R.R. Martin. This is kind of a historical book within the world of A Song of Ice and Fire. Think like the Silmarillion is like a historical book that tells a big swath of history of Middle-earth. This is kind of like that. Except to me, this is much more accessible and readable than the Silmarillion is. But this book is a history book about the Targaryen dynasty specifically. The whole book is about the Targaryens. That's the reason you're reading it. It starts from Aegon's conquest, and then it goes about 150 years after Aegon's conquest, and talks about all of the kings and the queens and the various bloodlines and all of the political intrigue and all of the marital intrigue and all that stuff. And it's about half of the Targaryen history. So I think that George Martin has proposed a sequel titled Blood and Fire, a reversal of the title that he would do one day, but I don't think that's ever going to happen because he first has to do Winds of Winter, which I don't think is going to happen now. I'm just giving up on getting more books. But I was like, you know what? I'll read what we have because I'm a huge fan of the TV shows, both Game of Thrones and House of the Dragon, which this book is the basis for. And I'm also a huge fan of the other books. I loved A Night of the Seven Kingdoms. This is a gorgeously written book. It's 3 novellas, but I thought it was so well written. I just loved everything about this book. And I'm so excited for the TV show that is coming out next year. I'll probably reread at least the first novella in here. It's 3 novellas. I'll probably reread at least the first one before the TV show because I love this so much. And then I've also read, of course, the A Song of Ice and Fire, aka Game of Thrones series. I absolutely love the first 3 books. I think they're amazing. I think they're fantastic. I think these first 3 books are just some spectacular, incredible, top-tier writing. And then I did not like the 4th book, if I'm being honest. It's so weak. I did not like the 4th book. The 5th book I enjoyed. It's not as good as the first 3, but it's better than the 4th one. So that's how I felt about the A Song of Ice and Fire series. So, George Martin likes his long books. And this is no different. This is 700 pages with very small print. And this is, as I mentioned, kind of a historical book. So it's not like you're seeing a lot of dialogue. You're not really seeing character interactions, character arcs in the traditional sense. This is not a novel, really. I would not categorize this as a novel. I would categorize this as authentic history. There was a podcast that Brian Young and Holly Fry did quite a long time ago titled Authentic History, and this is like the definition of that, where it's as if it's a history book for Westeros, but Westeros isn't real, so it's not actually history. It's fake history, authentic history. Anyway, and so I'm as a history teacher, I'm so fascinated by this type of thing. And George Martin just has a way to really get you engaged with the story. And I was interested in reading it to find out who were the best Targaryen leaders, who were the worst Targaryen leaders, what made them great, what made them bad. And in fact, I think that George Martin has such rich ideas in this book. Ideas about politics, ideas about governance, ideas about rulership and leadership that I think that you could write essays, and I think that you could do video series, and you could really do like in-depth thought discussions about this, because this is such rich ideas presented in this book. And I think that's the strongest element of the book, is what you could learn from it, not necessarily the story itself, which the story, I think, the stories are pretty good, pretty darn good. But I think that the ideas are just so rich. That's also something I love about the Game of Thrones world in general. In fact, I was teaching about, in my side note, I was teaching in one of my history classes. We were teaching about Edward, King Edward in Europe during the 1500s, who was the boy king who did not rule for very long. But when he did rule, he was known for listening to his advisors and for taking their advice and really just being a really wise king. And so there is, of course, a monologue. I know it's in the Game of Thrones TV show. I believe it's also in the books, but I know it's in the show, where Tywin talks about what makes a good king. And I loved that monologue. But I couldn't exactly quote it in my class because it's Game of Thrones and the subject matter. But still, the ideas from it could carry over into my lessons with my students about listening to people who are wiser than you. And so there's just such rich ideas in these types of books. And so I loved all of that. And then you have the stories themselves. The biggest percentage of the book, about 300-ish pages of the book, is A Dance of the Dragons, which is the whole story of the House of the Dragon TV show. You're following Rhaenyra trying to become the queen versus her half-brother Aegon, who is trying to become the king, and they are battling against each other with their armies and their politics and stuff. And that is the bulk of the book. It starts about page 360. The TV show starts about 360. And the story of The Dance of the Dragons goes until about page 650, about there. So about 300 pages of this 750-page book. The rest of the book, the last 100 pages is, the aftermath of The Dance of the Dragons, which I won't spoil. And the first half of the book is about what led to that. You read about Aegon's conquest. You read about his sons, Aenys and Maegor the Cruel, and then you read about Jaehaerys, good king, wise King Jaehaerys. And I just loved reading about all of them. Just reading about their rulership was so fascinating to me. Particularly, if I'm laying the cards on the table, I love King Jaehaerys. He's such a fascinating figure. He's flawed, and he makes mistakes in this book, but he's the one Targaryen ruler who actually not only listens to other people, but he also makes a lot of wise decisions throughout the book. He makes some stupid knuckle-headed ones, but he also makes some pretty wise decisions. And he also makes some cunning decisions too. He has that kind of George Martin underhandedness that great characters and great rulers have. So I really enjoyed reading about Jaehaerys. He was probably my favorite character in the book to follow. You also read about the seedy, gross elements of the Targaryen dynasty, all of the illegitimate children that they bear, and I won't use the word that you know what word I'm using, but all the illegitimate children that the Targaryens have, and you read about the consummation of certain marital acts for the Targaryens, and also some unsavory aspects of life. And I did not need the book to be that explicit. I think that you could still tell this book and emphasize the depravity of humanity. Emphasize how inbreeding causes problems. Emphasize the issues with the Targaryens and with Westerosian society without being explicit. I think that's the thing that a lot of authors, including George Martin, because clearly, that's a problem in the Song of Ice and Fire books. But I think you can tell this world and show it as dark as it is without explicitness. And that's the thing I think a lot of people mistake. They think that I like reading noble, bright fantasy. I do. I think that is a very aspirational form of fantasy that I really enjoy reading. However, I also understand that, grimdark is there and should be there, but I don't think grimdark needs to be as explicit as it is, and that's a major problem in the book, is the book gets way too explicit in some moments. And it was like, I would feel uncomfortable reading this book in public because of the explicit nature of it. And I know George Martin can write this type of a world, the world of Westeros, without getting too explicit, because A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms is a great book. I think there's like a handful of lines that made me go, ugh, reading that. But that book, that's almost a kid's book, almost. It's a very much more family-oriented, very appropriate book, and yet it still tells these really dark, complicated ideas in the world of A Song of Ice and Fire. And so, all right, I'll get off of that point. Talking about The Dance of the Dragons, the first season of the TV show is basically just 2 long chapters in this book that take place about 80 pages worth of material. And so, it's the first season of the show is just 80 pages worth. And I think the second season is about, I didn't count it when I was reading, but it's about, because the second season jumps around in the way that the order of events and stuff, but the second season's about 80 pages worth as well. But I thought it was adapted really well. I think both seasons were adapted. I think that, it's very difficult when you have a book that's not clearly written out. Like A Game of Thrones was easy to adapt because it had scene by scene and it was, very simple things to follow. Whereas Fire and Blood, because this is a historical account that's also a not reliable narrator, that's something I haven't talked about, is that this is a non-reliable narrator in that in your world history, they're looking at all these historical accounts and being like, this person, the king's fool, said this, but this historian said this, but the king's maester said this, and so you don't actually know what the true history is, and you have to kind of sift through it. And so because of that, it makes it kind of difficult because you don't have a singular nature for the book to follow. While at the same time, I think that affords an opportunity, because I think that in several places in this book, George Martin offers 3 or 4 explanations of what happens, and you can pick the best one for the TV show, the one that you think will work best to adapt. I really like that idea because that gives the showrunners a lot of freedom. And you can also kind of use that opportunity to be like, you know what, I like this version better. This is the version I'm going to imagine the history went. And you don't actually know definitively what happened. And I just find that so interesting. It's both a hurt and a help to the book. And the unreliable narrator just made the book feel different. Game of Thrones universe, the Game of Thrones books are, A Song of Ice and Fire, are very much, reliable narrator. You're reading what's happening. Characters may not know everything, but what you're reading within a certain viewpoint is what's happening. So it's just such an interesting dynamic to add to the world of this book. There's also things like, for instance, Season 2, I'm not going to directly spoil things, but I'm going to hint around them. If you've seen Season 2, you know what Blood and Cheese was. A lot of people were complaining that they didn't like the adaptation of Blood and Cheese in the show. After having read it in the book, yeah, the book is way darker, but the show is plenty dark enough. I think the show went as far as they needed to go. I didn't think that it was necessary. I didn't feel like the show was really missing that much. And honestly, I don't think, even if they had done that in the show, I don't know if they're going to have time in seasons 3 and 4 of the show to pay off how dark it was. I think the payoff's going to be very similar. So that didn't bother me. And a lot of the action sequences in here, were plenty dark. Whew. And let me just say, if this book is any indicator of where the show is going to go for seasons 3 and 4, this is going to be a bonkers show. This show, we ain't seen nothing yet with the House of the Dragon. Oh boy, does the latter part of the Dance of the Dragons get ridiculous. So the plot twists, the backstabbing, the political, jabbering to try to see who will get on top. Whoo, boy, is it going to get interesting, and are a lot of hearts going to get broken. That's all I'll say. So I really enjoyed this book. Of course, there's elements of it I didn't like. I felt it dragged in a few areas. Even in King Jaehaerys' timeline, I was like, okay, you're taking it a little long with Jaehaerys. Let's speed it up a little. But it's still an enjoyable book, and I had a blast with it. I think it's a fun read if you have the time. It took me longer than a book of this length normally would take me, because even though I had plenty of time to read, because I had to keep stopping and slowing down, because it's not a novel and I can't breeze through it. It's a historical book with really small print, and I really had to think about what I was reading. If you gloss over something, you miss years of history or something. So anyway, this was a great book. I'm going to give it like an 8.5 out of 10. If it had toned down some of the stuff, it could have been up to a 9 or 9.5. It was a really enjoyable book. So, and if he cut out some of the superfluous information that I feel like some of the stories could have been pared down. Anyway, I enjoyed this. If you've read Fire and Blood, let me know your thoughts in the comments section down below. And until next time, I'm Jonathan, and thank you for watching.